Bonjour, hey, cześć, hola, and hello. Welcome to week number 5. Our topic this week will be bilingual education. My name is Matthias Hutz and I work at Freiburg University of Education. In the first unit in Module 5, I would like to give you, first of all, a short overview about different types of bilingual education. Our guiding questions will be, what are the aims, outcomes, and benefits of different types of bilingual education? And what are the essential features and approaches of a classroom which promotes bilingualism? Although some people may think that bilingual education is a relatively recent phenomenon, we have to say that it's probably almost as old as human language itself, because humans have taught each other languages whenever they came into contact with each other. But in a more modern sense, we understand by bilingual education those schools and classrooms that teach some, most, or all subject content through two languages. Bilingual education includes a large variety of concepts from which educational institutions can choose, depending on their objectives and possibilities. So it is quite clear that there's also a great deal of variation. However, these programs have a number of things in common. They increase the learner's contact time with the target language. They focus very much on content, but at the same time foster the foreign language development of the learners in a very natural way and try to bring them to near native level in the second language. And they also usually aim to introduce language very early compared to traditional foreign language teaching, quite often already in the first grades in primary school. Many of these bilingual programs also share very similar goals. It is very important, for example, to create a supportive environment for both languages, which means that both languages are valued and appreciated. The main idea is to increase proficiency in the second language, which comes at no cost to the development in the first language. At the same time, a high level of academic achievement has to be reached across all subject and grade levels. Another objective is to promote cultural understanding and tolerance towards other cultures. And finally, the idea is to have a highly interactive classroom, which also involves the integration of skills such as listening, speaking, reading, and writing. In particular, in this short introduction, we will look at some strong forms of bilingual education, namely immersion, dual language education, heritage language programs, and content and language integrated learning. We will also briefly consider a weak form of bilingual education, submersion, since it's very common in many countries where we find immigration. Learning a language is a bit like jumping into deep water. You need to learn to swim very quickly so that you can understand what people say and that you can interact with them. The idea of diving into a language is also found in the concept of immersion, one of the most effective forms of bilingual education. Immersion is often compared to a language bath. The idea is that you are completely surrounded, totally immersed by the language. So we're talking about immersion when most of the curriculum and most of the subjects are taught through a second language. The main aim is bilingualism and biliteracy. In many cases, the learners speak the majority language and they learn either a minority language in a specific speech community or in an international language. Immersion programs in their modern sense started out in some French-speaking regions in Canada in the 1960s, when English-speaking children were sent to kindergartens and primary schools where they were taught in French. Since this form of immersion proved to be very successful in terms of language competence, immersion programs later on spread to many other countries all over the world. Dual language education is similar to immersion, but in this case two languages are taught in a balanced way, in alternation. There are normally more or less equal numbers of children speaking the majority language and children speaking the minority language. Dual language programs are relatively common in the USA, where English and Spanish are taught at the same time. Also, the European schools could be mentioned in this context. There are also so-called heritage language programs, which also aim for additive bilingualism. But here the most important objective is to maintain and revitalize a language, which for some reason is in danger of becoming extinct in a speech community. Therefore, it mainly aims at children who want to learn this minority language or whose parents or grandparents still speak it, hoping that the children will continue to speak it later in life as well. Classic examples are attempts to revitalize Maori languages in New Zealand or the Celtic languages, for example, in Wales, Scotland, or Ireland. The form of bilingual education which is probably most widespread in mainstream schools throughout Europe is CLIL, or Content and Language Integrated Learning. It's typically less intensive than immersion, but the general idea is quite similar, namely to teach content through subjects like history, geography, or maths in a foreign language. Many primary and secondary schools in Europe offer CLIL programs nowadays. Typically, children speak the majority language and learn a foreign language. Quite often this is English, but it can also be a different language that is considered important, for example, in border regions. Both CLIL and immersion will be dealt with in a more detailed way in Module 5.2 because of their effectiveness and popularity. Apart from these strong forms, there's also a weak form of bilingual education called submersion. Submersion is found in many countries with a large number of immigrants, migrant workers, and refugees, for example, in Germany. In this case, the objective is not additive bilingualism, but rather subtractive bilingualism. The general idea is to move children from their home language into the majority language in a mainstream school. Therefore, the majority language of the speech community, for example German, is used with possibly some initial support in the student's home language. Ultimately, however, the societal aim is assimilation into the mainstream society. One of the main challenges in this case is to integrate learners into the regular school system and later on into working life. In countries with a high degree of immigration from many different countries, the result is that there are often very heterogeneous, often multilingual classes with students who have grown up with the majority language and others who haven't, or only to some extent. Teachers therefore have to deal with great social, linguistic, and cultural diversity. In such schools, there's often little additional language support for the majority language or for the home language, which often slows down the acquisition process. In some cases, learners may not even become biliterate. Therefore, they may have problems understanding the content, which becomes increasingly more complex. Eventually, this may lead to lower academic achievement and possibly to poorer self-esteem. In the long run, it could also lead to high dropout rates in schools and proportionally high unemployment, and if this happens on a large scale, to major problems within a society. To break this vicious circle, it is necessary that students receive linguistic support in both the first and in the second language, in particular at the beginning of their school career. There are, of course, many differences between these bilingual programs, which are the result of various factors. For example, the learner's language profile as well as the teacher's language profile, the role of materials and resources, the allocations of subjects, or the balance between the languages. Let us briefly look at these factors. With respect to the learner's language profile, we may ask the following questions. Are all or most of the children from a language majority background? Do some or most of them speak a minority language? If so, do they speak the same minority language or different ones? And do they get any support from their parents? The teacher's language profile can also differ greatly because of the following issues. To what extent are the teachers or the teaching assistants bilingual? Do they use both languages, and do they encourage the learners to do the same? Are they native speakers or non-native speakers? Do they have any qualifications in bilingual education? Another factor is the balance between the languages in the classroom. Is the majority or minority language used almost entirely or dominantly? Is there an attempt to balance the languages equally? Is there a shift from the majority language towards the minority language at some point? And what are the expected outcomes? Which subjects or content areas are taught in the majority or in the minority language? The allocation of subjects in the classroom might differ from school to school, from class to class, and from year to year. In some cases, maths might be taught in the first year in the first language and in the second year in the other language. Another issue has to do with materials and resources. Are there sufficient materials for both the minority and the majority language in all subjects? Quite often there's a lack of materials in bilingual programs, and teachers are forced to produce their own materials. There are various challenges if a school decides to set up a bilingual education program, but there have been also numerous studies to analyze the effectiveness of bilingual education. In particular, the Canadian immersion programs have been researched quite thoroughly. So what are the findings concerning language proficiency in the first language and in the second language? And what are the findings concerning curriculum achievement and cultural achievement? The Canadian studies have shown that the strong forms of bilingual education have numerous advantages. Not surprisingly, of course, it was shown that children in bilingual schools had much higher levels of language competence compared to children in mainstream education. Another result was that, in general, competence in the first language did not suffer. This had often been a concern by parents and school teachers. After several years of schooling, children typically caught up after an initial lag. With respect to classroom achievement, no major difference was found. Students usually perform as well as children in mainstream education. Another probably more obvious finding was that bilingual education often results in greater tolerance and more positive attitudes towards other cultures and ethnicities. It has been argued as well that children with two well-developed languages tend to have certain cognitive advantages. For example, that they have more metalinguistic awareness or are even better at creative thinking. Well, the studies are a bit inconclusive in this respect. The last benefit refers to economic advantages, because being bilingual may result in better chances on the job market and higher employability. Colin Baker came up with 6 benefits bilingual speakers may have. They have communication advantages since they have literacy in 2 languages. They have cultural advantages because they have 2 language worlds of experience. They may have cognitive advantages or thinking benefits, for example, in terms of linguistic creativity. Curriculum advantages refer to an increased curriculum achievement, and possibly they may even have some character advantages because of a raised self-esteem. And finally, they may even have some cash advantages since they have economic and employment benefits. So there are many reasons why bilingual programs have become very popular in many parts of the world. In particular, they help learners to communicate with other people everywhere in the world. It helps them to say goodbye, also in different languages. To say, for example, farvel, adios, nekemin, do widzenia, and goodbye.